The photograph showed a man in a pressed collar and a clean shave, standing straight in front of what looked like a church door. The man waiting on the platform at Dubuque had grease on his knuckles, a hat that had been rained on so many times it had given up holding its shape, and was squinting at her the way a man squints at weather he doesn't trust. Josephine Hadley looked at him and thought, with the kind of clarity that only comes when you realize you've made a catastrophic mistake, this is not the same man. She was wrong about that. But she wouldn't know how wrong until the first hard frost came. I've told a lot of stories in my time. Stories about people who found each other when they weren't looking. And stories about people who nearly walked away from the best thing that ever happened to them. This is one of the second kind. And I'll tell you up front. The part that matters isn't the ending. It's what happened in the space between that platform in Dubuque and the night a barn burned down in the dark. Josephine Hadley was 34 years old, a school teacher out of Cincinnati who had spent the better part of a decade being called formidable by people who meant it as a warning. She had a habit of correcting grammar in casual conversation. She read legal briefs for pleasure. She had been engaged once to a man named Gerald who had called off the engagement after she argued, correctly, as it turned out, that his business partner was defrauding him. Gerald had taken the business partner's side. That told her everything she needed to know about Gerald, and she let him go without much grief. By 34 she had stopped waiting for someone to appear and had started making arrangements instead. The advertisement she answered had run in a farm journal, the kind of paper her father had kept on the kitchen table in the house she grew up in. Most of those ads read like livestock listings. So many acres, so many head, needs a woman who can cook and keep a house. This one was different. Iowa, farmer, widower, 2 sons grown and gone. Looking for a woman who isn't afraid of silence or hard work. No pretense on my, expect none on yours. There was something in the plainness of it that she respected. She wrote back the same day. The man who answered was named Cotter Webb. His letters were short in the way that a fence line is short, no unnecessary length, every word load-bearing. He wrote that he was 41, that he had farmed the same 300 acres outside of Garnavillo for 17 years, that his wife Marin had died 4 years prior of a fever that moved too fast for the doctor to catch, that he did not know what he was looking for exactly, but he knew what he wasn't looking for, and he listed those things plainly. A woman who needed to be entertained, a woman who would try to change the farm, a woman who was frightened of January. Josephine read that last line twice. She had spent 34 years being frightened of exactly nothing, and she found she liked being recognized for it, even at a distance, even in writing, even by a man she had never met. They exchanged 11 letters over 3 months. In those letters Cotter Webb turned out to be someone she had not expected. He had opinions about soil drainage and tariff policy, and the right way to treat a sick horse, and he expressed those opinions with the economy of a man who had spent a great deal of time alone, and had learned to make every word count. He did not flatter her. He disagreed with her once about the purpose of public schooling. He thought it had grown too abstract, too removed from practical knowledge, and he made his case with such plain logic that she found herself arguing back not out of defensiveness but out of genuine interest. He sent a photograph at her request. Clean shirt, clean shave. Taken at his older son's wedding, he wrote, 3 years prior. She arrived in Dubuque on a Thursday in early October with 2 trunks, a box of books, and the certainty, assembled from 11 letters and 1 photograph, that she knew the shape of the man she was meeting. The man on the platform had grease on his knuckles and a hat that had suffered, and a look about him that was not unfriendly but was not warm either. It was the look of a man who had learned to wait. He saw her step off the train, and he took off the hat, and he said, "Miss Hadley, I'm Cotter. The drive to the farm is about 2 hours. Roads decent until the last mile." He reached for the heavier of her 2 trunks without asking. She watched him hoist it into the back of the wagon with the ease of a man who lifts heavy things without thinking about it, and she thought, the photograph was taken 3 years ago. He has been outside every day of those 3 years. She thought, the letters were real, the man is just worn down to the working parts. She was not convinced, but she got into the wagon. The first hour they drove mostly in silence, and Josephine catalogued the things that were wrong. The hat, the grease which she later understood was axle grease from a wheel he'd repaired that morning. Though she didn't know that yet. The way he drove with one hand relaxed, as if he had made this trip 10,000 times and expected nothing from it. She had prepared herself for a man of a certain kind, and this man was assembling himself differently than she'd planned. Then he said without looking at her, "Red-tailed hawk. See it? Just above the tree line." She looked. There was a hawk riding a current of air above a stand of oaks that had gone orange with the season. "I see it," she said. "They pair up for life," he said, "which is either admirable or stubborn, depending on your view." She looked at him. He was still watching the road. "I think those aren't mutually exclusive," she said. He was quiet a moment. Then, "No, I suppose they're not." It was not a conversation, it was 2 sentences. But something in the way he'd said it, without argument, without the need to have the last word, with a kind of easy acknowledgement, stayed with her for the rest of the drive. He talked after that in the way a man talks when he's not performing. He told her the name of every county they passed through, and why the soil changed color between them. He explained that the oaks held their leaves longer than the maples because they were more reluctant to let go, which he said without any irony. Just as a fact about trees. He pointed out a farmhouse that had been abandoned in the drought years and never reclaimed, and he talked about the family who'd worked it, not with sentiment but with respect. They had been good farmers, he said, and the land had just turned against them, and there was no shame in that. By the time they reached the farm, Josephine had not revised her first impression, but she had added things to it that the first impression hadn't accounted for. The farmhouse was not what she'd expected either. It was small and very clean. There were curtains in the windows. Not a woman's touch, she realized, because Marin had been gone 4 years. Cotter had put them up himself, or left them where they were, which amounted to the same thing. There were shelves of books in the front room, more than she'd anticipated. Agricultural texts, certainly, but also history. A worn copy of Tocqueville. 2 volumes of Lincoln's speeches. He showed her to a room at the back of the house. It had a window that faced east toward a field that had been cut and left to stubble. "This is yours," he said. "The door locks from the inside. There's no arrangement here that you're obligated to until you decide there is." She had not expected that either. He left her to settle in, and she stood in the room for a long time looking out at the stubble field. And she thought about Gerald, who had treated a marriage proposal like a business acquisition. And she thought about the other men she had known, who had treated her intelligence like a problem to be managed. And she thought, this man has driven 2 hours to bring me here and asked nothing of me yet. She was not sure what to do with that. She had come to Iowa prepared to negotiate. She had not come prepared for courtesy. Over the following weeks, she waited for the other version of Cotter Webb to appear. Every woman who had ever agreed to an arrangement had at some point discovered that the arrangement came with terms that hadn't been written down. She waited for the version of him that would expect her to stop having opinions, or to fold herself smaller to fit the space he'd made, or to treat her schoolteacher's mind like something that needed to be kept in a separate room and brought out only occasionally, the way you treat a good coat. That version of him did not appear. When she told him she wanted to understand the farm's accounts, he handed her the ledger without hesitation. She spent 2 evenings with it and found 3 places where he'd been overpaying a feed supplier for years, not out of negligence, she decided, but because the supplier was an old friend and Cotter had not wanted to insult him by looking too closely. She showed him. He studied the numbers for a long time. He said. "You've been carrying him," she said. "I have," he said. "He had a bad year in 21. That was 8 years ago." He was quiet for a moment. "I didn't look at it that way. He probably doesn't know you know. You could renegotiate without embarrassing him." He looked at her. It was the longest he had looked directly at her since she'd arrived. "That's a better idea than the one I had," he said. "What was your idea?" "Keep paying." She didn't laugh exactly, but something in her face must have moved, because something in his face moved in response, and that was the first moment that felt like something other than 2 people being careful around each other. She began keeping the farm's books. She reorganized the filing system, which had been a collection of envelopes sorted by no method she could identify. She found a debt that was owed to the farm from a neighboring operation that Cotter had apparently forgotten about, or chosen to forget about, which she suspected was the same thing. He did not comment on any of these changes except to say once that he found things easier to find now. That was all. But it was not a small thing coming from a man who chose his words like a carpenter chooses nails. She noticed, too, that he never once suggested she should be doing something else. When she rode out to look at the south field, which she'd read about in the ledger, he saddled a horse for her without being asked, and told her to follow the fence line until it bent north. When she came back with observations about the drainage, which she'd read enough about by then to form a genuine opinion, he listened the way he always listened, without performing interest, without nodding too much, just with his full attention. And then he said that he had been thinking the same thing for 2 seasons but hadn't priced the labor for it yet. "I can figure that," she said. "All right," he said. She did. November came, and with it the kind of cold that settles into the bones of a place and stays. Josephine had grown up in Ohio, which thought it knew about winter, but Iowa winter was a different creature, flatter and wider and more certain of itself. The wind had nowhere to break against. It came across the open fields with the directness of a fact you'd rather not know. She had been on the farm for 6 weeks. She had not written the letter to her sister in Cincinnati. The letter she had half composed in her head on the train from Ohio. The one that explained that she would be returning shortly, and that the arrangement had not suited. She had not written it because every time she sat down to write it, she could not think of a true reason. The man was not who the photograph had shown her. He was worn where the photograph had shown him pressed, roughed where it had shown him smooth. But the letters, the 11 letters she had kept in a ribbon-tied packet at the bottom of her trunk, those were true. Every word of them was exactly true. She had come here trusting the letters and then, in the first 60 seconds on the platform, had transferred that trust to a photograph that was 3 years out of date. She was a schoolteacher. She corrected other people's errors. She was not accustomed to finding this kind of error in herself. She did not tell him that she'd been reconsidering from the start. She was too proud for that. Then came the night of the Alderman barn. Thaddeus Alderman farmed the land that shared a fence line with Cotter's north pasture. He was 62 years old, a widower, and he kept his barn in the way that old men sometimes keep the things that matter most to them, with the kind of maintenance that holds off disaster without quite defeating it. The fire started at midnight on a Tuesday in late November. No one knew the cause. Lightning was unlikely given the season. The most probable explanation was a lantern left burning too long in the hay. What mattered was that by the time the orange glow lit the sky to the north, the structure was already committed to burning. Cotter was up and dressed before Josephine had fully woken. She heard the back door, and she went to the window and saw the glow against the clouds, and she dressed in the dark and followed him out. He had already hitched the draft horse to the water tank he used for field irrigation. He was moving with the particular speed of a man who is not panicking but is not wasting a second either. "Stay here," he said, not unkindly. "I'm not staying here," she said. He looked at her once, then he said, "All right, then drive." She drove. By the time they reached the Alderman place, 3 other neighboring farms had already arrived. The men working a bucket line from the creek while Thaddeus Alderman stood in his yard in his nightclothes, watching 17 years of lumber and tools, and the grain he'd stored for winter turn into light and ash. His barn cat was on his shoulder. That detail lodged in Josephine's mind. The old man and the cat both watching, both past the point of doing anything about it. Cotter moved into the line without being directed. Josephine went to Thaddeus Alderman. She had met him once, briefly, at a Sunday gathering 3 weeks prior. He had tipped his hat and moved on. He was not a man who made much of new people. She stood beside him now and said nothing for a moment. There was nothing to say about the barn. The barn was going. Then she said, "Is your grain insured?" He looked at her as if she had said something unexpected. "No," he said. "Is the structure insured?" "Partly." "What do you have on hand for seed?" He blinked. "I've got the winter wheat set aside in the house, that's something," she said. "The rest we can figure in the morning." He looked at her for a long moment. "You're the woman Cotter Webb brought out," he said. "I am. He's a good man," Thaddeus Alderman said. It was not small talk. He said it the way a man states a known fact about the landscape. She watched Cotter in the bucket line. He was at the near end closest to the heat where the work was hardest. He had taken off his coat and left it on the fence post. His sleeves were rolled. He was not talking, he was working. She thought, "I know that man. I have been reading him for 3 months. I have been living beside him for 6 weeks. I know exactly who that man is." She thought, "I knew before I got to the platform. I just didn't trust what I knew." The barn burned to the footprint. The bucket line held the fire off the house and off the machine shed, which was the more important preservation. A man could rebuild a barn over time, but without his equipment he couldn't farm, and without the ability to farm he was lost. By 3 in the morning, the fire was down to coals. The men stood in the yard in the November cold, their breath making small clouds. Cotter came and stood beside her, and she could feel the heat still radiating off his coat where the fire had warmed it. "Alderman going to be all right?" he asked. Not her, he was asking himself, she realized. "I think so," she said. "His seed wheat is in the house, his machine shed is standing, he has neighbors." Cotter looked at her. She had said neighbors the way he'd have said it. Not as an abstraction but as a practical resource. "You handled him well," Cotter said. "He doesn't take to people easily. He takes to useful people," she said. "He just hasn't met enough of them." Cotter almost smiled. She had seen that expression twice now, the thing his face did when it was about to become something warmer than its default. And then thought better of it and stopped just short. She was starting to read it the way she read his letters. They drove back to the farm in the dark, the draft horse knowing the road better than either of them. The cold was absolute. Josephine had her hands inside her sleeves. Cotter said from the dark beside her, "I know you came here with a different picture of it." She didn't answer immediately. "The photograph was 3 years old," she said. "I should have said so." "You should have." Silence. "Did you think about leaving?" he asked. She considered lying. She considered it for about 3 seconds. "Yes," she said, "in the first week." "What stopped you?" She thought about it. The real answer was complicated and she'd been sorting through it for 6 weeks without arriving anywhere final. The best she could do was the truest approximation. "I kept reading the letters," she said, "and then I kept watching. And what I watched kept matching what I'd read." He was quiet for a long time. Long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he said, "I knew you were measuring me against something. I figured if I just kept being what I am, the measuring would settle." She looked at the side of his face in the dark. "You knew? You're not hard to read for a woman who's careful about what she shows." She had spent 34 years being told she was formidable. She had spent weeks believing she was being discreet. She was slightly humbled by this, and she was not a woman who was easily humbled. "And if I'd left," she said, "then you'd have been wrong about something, and I'd have carried on," he said. "But I was hoping you wouldn't be wrong." She turned back to the road. The farmhouse lights were visible through the trees ahead. The lamp she'd left burning in the front room casting a pale square into the dark. It was not a declaration, it was Cotter Webb being exactly as plain as his letters had promised. And she found, sitting on the cold wagon seat with her hands inside her sleeves. That plain was the thing she had been waiting for, without knowing she'd been waiting for it. They were married in the Clayton County Courthouse, on the 14th of December, 6 weeks after the Alderman fire, on a Thursday morning, with the Justice of the Peace and his secretary as witnesses. Josephine wore a dress that was dark green because that was the nicest dress she'd brought. Cotter wore the same hat, because he had only one hat, but he had gotten the shape of it right again somehow. And she didn't mention the irony of that until much later. They farmed the 300 acres together for 29 years. Josephine kept the books, and within 2 years she had restructured the farm's debt, in a way that freed up enough capital to put in the drainage work on the south field that both of them had been thinking about independently. The south field, after drainage, produced better than any other parcel on the property for the next 2 decades. Cotter never made her feel that the idea had been hers and not his. He told the county extension agent without flourish that his wife had figured the financing, and the extension agent had looked at Josephine with the expression of a man reassessing something he thought he already understood. Cotter managed the land and the animals. He knew things about soil and weather and the behavior of livestock that she learned slowly, over seasons, by watching and asking. He was patient with her questions in the way that a man is patient when he respects the person asking. Not condescending patience, the real kind. They argued about things. The proper rotation for the north field. The pricing of winter wheat in a buyer's market. Whether it was worth repairing the fence on the east side or cheaper to let that pasture go fallow for a season. They argued with their sleeves rolled up, at the kitchen table, over the ledger or a map of the property. And they argued in the way that two people argue when neither one of them is trying to win. When they are both just trying to get to the right answer, and the right answer matters more than being the one who found it. They had no children of their own, but Cotter's 2 grown sons, who had been wary of her in the first year, came around in the way that grown children come around. When they see that the woman their father chose is making their father's life better, rather than different. The older son's wife became a friend to Josephine in the way that women become friends when they recognize each other. Slowly, over multiple holidays, through the accumulation of small acts that add up to something. And the farm gathered people. That was the thing she had not expected. The farm gathered people the way a certain kind of place always does. Not because it is fancy, but because it is solid and the people in it are trustworthy, and in a county where those qualities matter, the word gets around. Neighbors came for advice. Young farmers came to see how the drainage had worked on the south field. Thaddeus Alderman came every winter for coffee, until he was too old to drive, and then he came whenever his grandson could bring him. And Josephine always had the coffee on. She never forgot the photograph. She kept it actually, tucked into the back of the first ledger she'd worked in, which she kept on the shelf in the farm office long after the accounts had moved to newer books. She kept it not as a reminder of the mistake, but as a record of how close she had come to making it permanent. In the last years, when her eyesight was going and she did the accounts by feel more than sight, her daughter-in-law found the photograph one afternoon and brought it to her and asked who the clean-shaved man was. "That's your father-in-law," Josephine said. The daughter-in-law looked at it and looked at Cotter, who was visible through the window mending fence in the November light, white-haired now and using a fence post for balance but moving with the same economy he'd always had. "I wouldn't have known him," she said. "Neither did I," Josephine said. "I looked at that photograph and thought I knew exactly who I was going to meet. Then I met him and I had to start over." The daughter-in-law waited. "He knew," Josephine said. "He could see from my face on the platform that I was disappointed. He told me years later that he'd decided to just keep being himself and let the evidence do the work." She set the photograph down on the table. 30 years and the evidence held. Cotter Webb died in 1962 in the same house he had farmed from 2 days after haying season at the age of 70. Josephine lived until 1971, she was 68. After he died she continued to run the farm with the help of the older son who had moved back to the county by then. And she continued to keep the books until the winter of her last year when her hands finally gave out. And even then she checked the figures her grandson showed her, because old habits are the ones that last. She kept the photograph in the ledger until the end. When the older son cleaned out the farm office, he found it and asked his wife if she knew what it was. She told him. He stood there holding it for a long time, this photograph of a younger version of his father in a clean collar in front of a church door, looking directly at the camera with the expression of a man who is trying to appear more certain than he is. He was afraid too, the son thought. He just didn't let the fear do the talking. There are people we nearly miss. That's what I want you to sit with, after this story. Not the romance of it, though it is that, but the arithmetic. The 3 months of letters that built something real. The photograph that almost undid it in 60 seconds. The 2 hours of driving that rebuilt it, piece by piece, because a man named Cotter Webb pointed at a hawk and said something honest about stubborn things that pair for life. We carry pictures in our minds of the people we're about to meet. We build those pictures out of what we've heard, what we've imagined, what we need to believe. And then we stand on the platform and the real person arrives. And they are almost always different from the picture. The question isn't whether they're different. They will be. The question is whether we have the patience to stay in the wagon long enough to find out who's actually sitting beside us. Josephine Hadley knew this, eventually. She kept the photograph to make sure she didn't forget how close she'd come to not knowing it at all. I'll ask you what I always ask at the end of a story like this. Have you ever been wrong about someone in the first minute? And if you stayed past that minute, what did you find? Tell me in the comments. I'll read every one. And if this story stayed with you, there's another one right here that I think you'll want to hear.